One of America's most chilling mysteries began with a fire and left behind decades of unanswered questions. On Christmas Eve 1945, the Sodder children vanished without a trace, sparking a case that still confounds investigators and grips the public's imagination. Was it a tragic accident, a deliberate cover-up, or something far more sinister lurking beneath the ashes? As time passes, the truth remains elusive, but the mystery endures. Haunting all who dare to look deeper into the night, the children disappeared. The night of the tragedy. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in the quiet town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. Snow rested gently on rooftops, and warm yellow lights flickered through frosted windows. At the Sodder household, nestled along Route 16, the evening was filled with the cheerful clamor of a large family gathered for the holidays. George and Jenny Sodder, proud parents of 10 children, had spent the day in celebration with 9 of them. Their eldest son was away, serving in the military. Laughter echoed through the house as the children unwrapped gifts, nibbled on treats, and played late into the night. By 10 p.m., the younger children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Betty, begged their mother to let them stay up longer. Jenny agreed, but with conditions. They had to remember to switch off the lights, close the curtains, and lock the door before heading to bed. She assumed they would eventually make their way upstairs to the attic, where they normally slept. Jenny took the youngest, 2-year-old Sylvia, up with her and George. Marion, their 17-year-old daughter, had already dozed off on the couch downstairs after an early shift at work. 2 of the older boys, John and George Jr., had gone to bed in the attic after spending the day helping their father with the coal trucks. The house began to settle into silence, the warmth of the holiday still lingering in the air. But at around 12:30 a.m., Jenny was stirred from her sleep by the ringing of the telephone. Odd, she thought. Who would be calling at this hour on Christmas Eve? She went downstairs and answered. A woman's voice, unfamiliar and slightly slurred, asked for someone Jenny didn't know. Laughter floated in the background, light, eerie, unsettling. Jenny told the caller she had the wrong number. The woman laughed strangely, and the line went dead. As Jenny stood in the darkened hallway, a chill passed over her. She noticed that the living room lights were still on. The curtains remained open, and the front door was unlocked. Marion was still asleep on the couch, undisturbed, but the rest of the children were nowhere in sight. Jenny quietly closed the curtains and locked the door. She returned upstairs, assuming the children had gone to bed in the attic as planned. But something was wrong. Roughly 30 minutes later, around 1 a.m., Jenny awoke again, this time to a loud thump against the roof. It was followed by a rolling noise. She lay frozen for a moment, heart racing, listening in the dark. Then came the unmistakable scent of smoke. She bolted upright and roused George. Smoke was curling into the hallway. The house was on fire. Panic erupted. George and Jenny scrambled to wake the children. Sylvia was carried to safety. Marion, John, and George Jr. were all located and hurried outside. But 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny Jr., and Betty, were nowhere to be seen. The parents screamed their names into the smoke. No answer. George tried to ascend the stairs, but they were engulfed in fire. He ran outside to retrieve the ladder, which was always propped against the house. Only now it was gone. Desperate, he sprinted to his trucks, hoping to drive one beside the house and climb on top to reach the attic windows. But neither truck started. Both had worked perfectly the day before. The fire raged with terrifying speed. Flames devoured the wooden structure, collapsing walls and swallowing rooms. Jenny ran to a neighbor's home to call for help. The operator didn't answer. Another neighbor drove to town in search of firefighters. By the time the fire brigade arrived, hours later, the house was ash, rubble, and silence. And 5 children were gone. No one saw them leave. No one heard them scream. They had vanished into the fire or into something else entirely. The Sodder family's Christmas had begun with joy. By dawn, it was a nightmare. A mystery sealed behind a wall of flames, smoke, and silence that would never truly clear. But it doesn't end here. No. This is only the beginning of an endless web of lies, mysteries, and uncovered truths. Stay with us as we go deeper into the story. The beginning of the end. The family, now left with nowhere to live, had to start building a new life for themselves. Of course, it wasn't going to be where their old home once stood, since that place had been turned into a memorial garden in remembrance of the 5 children. George Sodder was overseeing construction of the new house when one of his workers approached him. It was a telephone repairman, and he had found something troubling. Climbing up a nearby utility pole, he had expected to see charred remnants of the wire that once led to the Sodder house. But there was no burnt cable at all. What he saw was much stranger. The wire had been cleanly cut, not melted, not frayed, deliberately severed. As the weight of this information settled in, George's mind spun. If the telephone wire hadn't been destroyed by fire, then someone had climbed up and sliced it, and they would have needed a ladder to reach that height. A ladder. The realization hit him like a jolt. On the night of the fire, in his desperate attempt to reach his children trapped upstairs, George had searched frantically for the ladder that was always propped against the house. But it was gone. Suddenly driven by an urgent instinct, George darted off across the property. He searched under bushes, behind piles of rubble, and around the scorched remains of what used to be his home. Finally, he found it, the missing ladder, discarded far from where it belonged. It hadn't been misplaced, it had been moved. Everything started to come together. George's thoughts flooded with details from the night of the fire. The strange thud on the roof just before flames erupted. The phone call in the middle of the night with the giggling woman asking for a non-existent person. And most damning, the trucks. He had rushed outside to move them under the window, hoping to climb atop and rescue his children, only to discover that neither would start. This fire wasn't an accident. It was arson. George's mind reeled. Had someone truly wanted to harm them? Could someone from their own town have done this? Jenny was tormented by memories of her children. The image of them sleeping in their beds haunted her. But more than that, her mind twisted with questions she couldn't ignore. Why hadn't they heard any screams during the blaze? The house was small. If the children were trapped, wouldn't they have called out? And after the fire, there were no skeletal remains, not even a trace of bone in the ashes. How could 5 bodies leave nothing behind? Jenny couldn't rest. Every small inconsistency consumed her. Desperate to make sense of it all, she conducted a simple experiment. She began collecting bones from their family dinners, chicken legs, pork chops, beef ribs, and placed them in her oven at the highest possible temperature. She burned them again and again, trying to replicate what she imagined had happened in the fire. But even after hours of intense heat, the bones refused to disintegrate. They blackened, they cracked, but they never turned to ash. The house fire had been far hotter, she knew, but this small kitchen experiment gave her something to hold on to. A possibility. And when she spoke to a local crematorium employee, her conviction only grew stronger. He confirmed that even in professional cremation ovens, bones remain. Human bones cannot simply vanish, not even in extreme heat. Jenny clung to this truth with a mother's tenacity. She no longer believed her children had died in the fire. If there were no remains, then perhaps her children had never died at all. The fire, she now believed, had been a cover, a distraction. A smokescreen for something far worse, a kidnapping. With that terrifying thought, Jenny and George began to rethink everything from the weeks leading up to the fire. Odd encounters that once seemed harmless now felt sinister. A strange man had once appeared at their home asking about work. Though George wasn't hiring, the man lingered. He even pointed to the fuse boxes on the house and warned, "This is going to cause a fire someday." George dismissed him at the time. Now he wasn't so sure. Jenny recalled seeing an unfamiliar car idling near their house, the driver watching her children as they returned home from school. The memory, long buried, now filled her with dread. Were they being watched? Targeted? George also had enemies. As an outspoken critic of Mussolini, he'd drawn ire from certain members of the Italian-American community in Fayetteville. A new revelation and a lie. It was more than a year after the fire when a local man came forward with a story that shook the already reeling Sodder family. The man, a bus driver, told police that he had been driving his route late on Christmas Eve in 1945 when he passed the Sodder home. As he approached, something strange caught his eye. In the darkness, he saw someone near the house lobbing what he described as balls of fire toward the building. The account was disturbing enough to send the Sodder family back to the site of the fire. This time with fresh eyes and sharper instincts, they combed the grounds, scouring the property for anything that might have been overlooked in the chaos of that awful night. And then, purely by chance, something extraordinary happened. 2-year-old Sylvia, the youngest of the Sodder children, wandered off during the search. Unaware of the weight of the moment around her, she toddled across the lawn until something caught her eye. It was a round object lying in the grass. Curious, she bent down and picked it up. To her, it probably looked like a toy. But when her parents caught sight of it, they rushed to her side and gently took it from her small hands. George studied the object, baffled. It was metal, ball-shaped, but with an unusual cap on one end. He had no idea what it was. But John, the oldest Sodder son, had just returned home on military leave, and he recognized it immediately. It was an incendiary grenade, a device designed not to explode outward, but to ignite whatever it touched. It burned hot and fast, often used in combat to destroy structures. It didn't just start fires. It ensured they raged out of control. Suddenly, several things clicked into place. The mysterious thud on the roof that George had heard just before the fire erupted. These weren't random sounds, they were the grenade striking the house and bouncing downward. And the fire's origin point, believed by authorities to be in the fuse box on the ground floor, had never made sense to George or Jenny. Now, it made even less. If someone had lobbed this weapon onto the roof, then the fire likely started upstairs, exactly where the missing children had been sleeping. They had physical evidence of foul play, military-grade weaponry lying in their yard, and a credible witness claiming to have seen an attack in progress. Surely, this would be enough for local law enforcement to reopen the case as arson. But the response was silence. No one from the police or fire department acted on the new evidence. No statements, no investigations. The incendiary grenade, despite being clear proof of malicious intent, was dismissed or ignored. George and Jenny were stunned. They had always suspected something dark had happened that night, but now that they had proof, no one seemed willing to listen. And yet, more revelations were still to come. That same year, 2 women independently approached authorities with even more startling claims. One of them worked at a roadside diner several hours away from Fayetteville. She claimed that on the morning after the fire, she served breakfast to a group of children, 5 of them accompanied by a group of unfamiliar adults. She had no idea who they were at the time, but when she saw news reports about the missing Sodder children, she swore those were the same kids. She also remembered something else. The adults had Florida license plates. The second woman, a hotel maid in Charleston, West Virginia, said she had seen 4 of the 5 children about a week after the fire. They had checked into the hotel around midnight, accompanied by several stern, unsmiling adults who spoke fluent Italian. The group had stayed only briefly and kept to themselves. To the Sodders, these reports were both hope and horror. Could their children still be alive? Had they somehow survived the fire only to be taken far away? Jenny found herself wondering if this was all tied back to George's outspoken anti-Mussolini views. He had made enemies within the Italian-American community, people who had once warned him to silence his political beliefs or face consequences. Was this revenge? If so, then the worst possibility emerged. The children had been taken overseas, to Italy, where no American police could follow. The emotional toll on the Sodders was immense. It had been over a year since their home had been reduced to ashes, and still they had no solid answers. Only suspicion, silence, and mounting terror. Frustrated and desperate, the Sodders turned to the only higher authority they could think of. In 1947, they wrote to the FBI. They poured out every detail: the cut phone line, the incendiary device, the sightings of their children. They pleaded for help. To their surprise, they received a personal response from none other than FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. But the reply was not what they'd hoped. With the door to justice slammed shut, once again, the Sodders grew impatient and restless. What did they do next? Continue watching to find out. Hiring a private investigator. By 1947, George and Jenny Sodder had grown tired of waiting. Local authorities were ignoring their pleas, federal agencies refused to get involved, and more than a year had passed without any sign of their 5 missing children. So they took the next logical step. They hired a private investigator. The man's name has been lost to history, but his presence in Fayetteville didn't go unnoticed. As he asked questions around town, one rumor began to rise above the rest. A strange, persistent story that Fire Chief F.J. Morris, the very man who led the firefighting effort at the Sodder home, had discovered something unusual in the ashes: a human organ. It was a shocking contradiction to the official narrative. On Christmas Day, the fire department had assured the Sodders that no trace of their children had been found. No bones, no teeth, nothing. But if Morris had actually found a human organ and deliberately concealed it, it would mean the authorities not only lied, but actively sabotaged the investigation. The rumor didn't stop there. Supposedly, Morris had placed the organ in a dynamite box and buried it somewhere on the property. The private investigator, increasingly disturbed, reported the story to George and Jenny. Even he didn't know what to make of it. It sounded far-fetched, maybe even delusional, but he had heard it from too many unrelated sources to ignore. The Sodders didn't hesitate. They returned to the site of the fire, bringing shovels and their surviving children. The area had changed. Grass was beginning to grow back, and Jenny had planted flowers where her children's bedroom had once stood. Digging through this patch of soil, freshly disturbed a year earlier by fire and loss, was deeply painful. But they had to know the truth. One of the shovels struck something hard, hollow. The family gathered around. It was a box, wooden, weather-worn. They lifted it out of the ground with shaking hands. It was exactly what the rumors had described: a dynamite box. They pried it open. Inside was a shriveled, leathery lump of organic matter. Flesh, no question about it. A funeral director was called in to examine the discovery. If it turned out to be a human organ, especially a child's, it could upend the entire case. But the reality was even stranger. It wasn't human. It wasn't even burnt. It was a beef liver. They went straight to Fire Chief Morris. Pressed for an answer, he finally admitted what he'd done. Yes, he had buried the box. Yes, he had planted the organ. But, he said, it wasn't part of any criminal cover-up. It was, according to him, a misguided attempt to bring the family closure. Morris said he was certain the children had perished in the fire, but watching the family exhaust themselves in a relentless, heartbreaking search for answers had been too much for him to bear. So he'd taken matters into his own hands. He acquired a beef liver, placed it in a box, and buried it at the scene. Then he began to circulate the rumor, hoping that if the Sodders found remains, they might finally accept the loss and move on. Though this lead had fizzled into something grotesque and inexplicable, the private investigator had one more thread to pull, and this one was far more serious. George had once been close with a man named Nick, a fellow Italian immigrant who had worked with him for years. George had even asked Nick to co-sign a home insurance policy, but after bitter political arguments, particularly about Mussolini, their relationship fell apart. The PI dug into this former friendship and uncovered a string of alarming details. First, Nick had secretly increased the value of George's insurance policy by $250 shortly before the fire, an action that would benefit Nick as a co-signer if George and his family were to perish. But even more damning was the revelation that Nick had served on the coroner's jury, the very panel that ruled the fire an accident. With this explosive information in hand, the Sodders approached the local prosecutor. Surely this would be enough to launch a formal investigation, or at least remove the cloud of accident from the official ruling. But the prosecutor took one look at the evidence and then calmly shut the door on them. "I don't want to bring a case against people with whom I live and eat," he told them. George and Jenny were speechless. After all they did, it was clear that no amount of evidence would compel the local powers to act. It was as if Fayetteville had closed ranks to protect its own. A series of mysterious events. By 1953, nearly 8 years after the fire, the leads have grown cold, and the Sodders are running out of options. They've written to the FBI, confronted fire chiefs, chased rumors across the country, and even hired private investigators. But now, all that's left to them is a desperate cry for help, a billboard. They erect it right alongside Route 16, not far from the site of the fire. The board displays pictures of all 5 missing children, frozen in time with youthful smiles and hopeful eyes. Alongside the photos, bold black lettering asks, what was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive? Below that, a $5,000 reward for any information. It is, more than anything, a symbol of refusal. A refusal to forget. A refusal to move on. The billboard soon becomes a landmark in Fayetteville, passed daily by locals, travelers, and tourists. It keeps the mystery alive, but it also makes the Sodders a permanent fixture of grief, both admired and whispered about. Throughout the next decade, George and Jenny received dozens of letters and postcards from all over the country. People claim to have seen their children in places as far-flung as California, Oklahoma, and Florida. Most of the leads are weak, if not outright hoaxes, but the Sodders follow every single one. One day, George sees a photograph in a New York newspaper of a young girl. Something about her face, her dark eyes, the shape of her chin, reminds him of Betty. Convinced it might be his daughter, he travels all the way to New York and demands to see her in person. The girl's parents are understandably alarmed and refuse. George, deeply emotional, tries to persuade them, but ultimately backs down. He leaves empty-handed, haunted by a single terrible thought. What if that really was her? Jenny becomes equally consumed. She fixates on a story they heard early on, the woman at the Charleston motel who claimed she saw the children being whisked away in a car with Florida license plates. That one detail sticks with her. Eventually, she makes an unusual call. She contacts her brother, who lives in Florida, wondering aloud whether he could somehow be involved. By the 1960s, the Sodders are no longer searching for missing children. They're searching for missing adults. Had the 5 vanished kids survived, they would be in their 20s by now, grown, changed, possibly with families of their own. But still, the tips come in. In 1966, the Sodders receive a letter from a woman in Texas. She claims to have overheard 2 men at a bar speaking in low tones, names exchanged during the conversation: Louis and Maurice Sodder. They mention a fire, a family, and a place that sounds suspiciously like West Virginia. George jumps on the first train to Texas. When he arrives, he manages to track the men down, but the lead dissolves. They deny everything. There's no evidence, no explanation, just another cruel dead end. But then, in 1967, a different kind of clue arrives. A letter, postmarked from Central City, Kentucky. No return address. Inside is a black and white photograph of a young man, roughly in his 30s. The resemblance to Louis, one of the missing boys, is eerie. On the back of the photograph, in unfamiliar handwriting, a chilling message is scrawled: Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Ilil boys. A 90,132 or 35. The message is cryptic. Parts of it make no sense. But Louis Sodder is clear. Jenny and George are electrified. They study the photograph obsessively. The man's nose, his eyes, the curl of his lip. They swear it's him. Older, yes, but undeniably their son. They hire another private investigator, this time to travel to Kentucky and follow the trail. He agrees, and then vanishes. The Sodders never hear from him again. No letter, no bill, no report, nothing. He simply disappears, taking with him their hope, their money, and perhaps the last real lead they will ever receive. By the 1970s, their search has lost momentum. Their bodies are tired. Their hearts are broken. Yet the billboard remains. They even expand it, adding the photograph they received in 1967. Now the boyish grins are joined by the solemn face of a man who may or may not be one of them. No matter how long it stands, it never gets easier to look at. Grief is one thing, but mystery is crueler. It never ends. The Sodder children remain frozen in time, their images staring out at every driver who passes beneath that billboard. A silent, eternal question echoes from their painted eyes. What was our fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or still alive? Today, nearly 80 years since the Sodder home burned to the ground, the mystery continues to haunt true crime enthusiasts, amateur sleuths, and anyone who's ever passed by that iconic billboard in West Virginia. Over the decades, countless investigators, journalists, and online theorists have claimed to solve the case. They've argued that the fire consumed the children completely, that grief clouded the Sodders' judgment, that the family simply couldn't accept a tragic yet ordinary explanation. But for every argument that claims closure, there's a detail or a dozen that still doesn't quite fit. Yes, some experts insist that bone fragments could have easily been destroyed in the heat of the fire, even though modern forensics suggests otherwise. Others say the sightings were mere coincidences, hallucinations born from desperation. They point to the Sodder's emotional trauma, the chaos of the investigation, the untrained firefighting crew, and the era's lack of scientific precision. To many, this case has already been explained. A terrible accident, compounded by misinformation and decades of grief-fueled speculation. But that version of the story doesn't satisfy everyone, and for good reason. Because when you dig into the case, it quickly becomes clear that this isn't just about a fire. It's about inconsistencies, anomalies, and unanswered questions. The cut phone lines, the missing ladder, the eyewitness reports of the children after the fire, the planted organ, the shady behavior of local officials, the fire chief's deception, the man who told George beforehand that his house would go up in smoke, the photograph of an unknown man claiming to be Lewis, the private investigator that disappeared without a trace. Too many things had to go wrong. Too many people had to lie, look away, or cover something up. And so, no matter how often the case is labeled solved, there remains a lingering feeling that something is missing, not just from the record, but from the truth itself. Even members of the Sodder family continued to believe, long after the flames, that their siblings were alive somewhere, possibly unaware of who they really were. They lived and died carrying that belief, not because they were delusional, but because the facts never comfortably aligned with the official version of events. To this day, the case remains officially unsolved, and for those who truly study it, who sit with all the contradictions, all the buried details and bizarre twists, that's not just a matter of opinion. It's the only conclusion that makes sense. Because until there's proof, there is no closure. Only questions. Only mystery. Outro. What do you think happened to the Sodder children? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below, and don't forget to hit the like button. If you want to watch more videos like this one, make sure to follow our channel so you don't miss out on any new updates.